In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was $79. Not $790, not $7,900, $79. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth, poorer than Ghana, poorer than Sudan, poorer than most of sub-Saharan Africa. Japan, which had colonized Korea for 35 years, stripped its industry, conscripted its workers, and left it devastated in 1945, had a GDP per capita of $479, 6 times richer. The teacher had left the student with nothing. 60 years later, South Korea has overtaken Japan. The student beat the teacher. This is the story of how. $79 in 1960. The same income per person as today's poorest countries on earth. That is where South Korea started. South Korea's rise from $79 to $35,000 GDP per capita in 60 years is the fastest sustained economic development in human history. It was built on a specific formula: export-led industrialization, education above everything, and a set of family conglomerates, the Chaebol, that were given every advantage and held to ruthless performance standards. Japan had the same formula first. The difference is what happened next. Japan's asset bubble burst in 1989, and the country spent 3 decades unable to escape the trap. South Korea watched Japan make every mistake and in several critical areas chose differently. That is how the student overtook the teacher. Chapter 1. Korea in 1960, The Inheritance of Colonization. To understand South Korea's achievement, you have to understand what it started from. Not just the poverty, though $79 per capita is almost incomprehensibly low, but the specific reasons for that poverty and why those reasons made the subsequent achievement even more remarkable. Japan colonized Korea in 1910 and ruled it until 1945. The colonial period was economically complex. Japan did industrialize Korea, building railways, factories, and infrastructure. But it industrialized Korea for Japan's benefit, not Korea's. Korean workers were paid less than Japanese workers doing the same jobs. Korean landowners were displaced by Japanese landlords. Key industrial positions were reserved for Japanese managers and engineers. When Japan left in 1945, it took the knowledge, the management, and most of the capital with it. The factories remained, but the people who knew how to run them had gone. Then came the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The war killed between 2.5 million and 3 million people and destroyed what little industrial infrastructure the colonial period had left. By the armistice in 1953, Korea was divided, devastated, and dependent on American aid for basic survival. The country produced essentially nothing that the world wanted to buy. Its exports in 1960 were $33 million, the equivalent of what a single medium-sized company might export today. The political situation was no more stable than the economic one. The first South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, was authoritarian and corrupt. In 1960, student protests forced him from power. The following year, General Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup. Park would rule South Korea for 18 years until his assassination in 1979. He was not a Democrat. He ran a police state. He imprisoned opponents. He was also, by any objective economic measure, the most consequential leader in South Korean history, and the person most responsible for what South Korea became. Before I explain what Park did, I want you to hold this comparison. Japan and South Korea both used the same basic development model. Both were authoritarian states that directed industrial policy, protected domestic companies, and used exports to drive growth. Japan did it first and built the world's second-largest economy. South Korea did it second and eventually surpassed Japan on key measures. The question the episode answers: what did South Korea learn from Japan, and what did it refuse to copy? Chapter 2. Japan in 1960, The Teacher at its Peak.
Japan in 1960 was 15 years into what would become one of the great economic miracles of the 20th century. GDP per capita was $479, modest by Western standards, but growing at over 9% per year through the 1950s and 1960s. The Japanese model, meaty-directed industrial policy, keiretsu conglomerates, lifetime employment, export-led manufacturing, was being studied and imitated across Asia. Japan's model worked on the same principles that would later drive South Korea and China. Cheap labor plus foreign technology plus export discipline equals rapid industrialization. The Japanese government directed credit to priority sectors. Domestic markets were protected while companies built competitive advantage in manufacturing. Exports were everything, not because the government told companies to export, but because the domestic market was too small and too poor to sustain world-scale manufacturing. Only by selling to the world could Japanese companies achieve the volume needed to drive down costs and build genuine competitive capability. By 1968, Japan had the second largest economy in the world, overtaking West Germany. By the early 1970s, Japan's companies were so competitive in electronics, steel, and automobiles that American industries were demanding protection from Japanese imports. The teacher was at the top of the class, and South Korea was watching every move. Chapter 3. Park Chung-hee's Formula. Park Chung-hee took power in 1961 with an economy that produced almost nothing and a population that was, by most measures, among the poorest in the world. He died in 1979 with an economy growing at 10% per year, exports that had risen from $33 million to $15 billion, and a GDP per capita that had gone from $79 to over $1,700. What he built in 18 years is the foundation of everything South Korea is today. Park's formula had four components. The first was export-led industrialization. Every economic decision was judged by whether it increased South Korea's ability to sell things to the world. Domestic consumption was depressed to fund investment. Workers were paid less than their productivity justified to keep export prices competitive. The exchange rate was managed to favor exporters. Everything that might reduce competitiveness, worker rights, environmental standards, wage growth, was treated as a luxury the country could not yet afford. The second was the Chaebol system. Park selected a small number of family-owned conglomerates, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, and SK, and gave them preferential access to capital, technology licenses, and government contracts. In exchange, these companies were required to hit export targets. Failed to meet the targets, and the preferential treatment disappeared. This created a system of performance-based industrial policy. The government picked winners, but the winners had to actually win. It was not simply cronyism, it was directed capitalism with accountability built in. The third was education. Korea, under Park, invested in education at a rate that was extraordinary given how poor the country was. By the 1970s, South Korea had universal primary and secondary education. By the 1980s, it had one of the highest university attendance rates in the world. The cultural emphasis on education, which predates Park and traces to Confucian traditions, was channeled into the specific technical and engineering skills that the industrialization required. Korean engineers understood the factories they were building. They did not merely assemble foreign technology, they absorbed it, understood it, and eventually improved on it. The fourth was borrowed technology. Korea in the 1960s had no technological capability of its own. Park negotiated a normalisation treaty with Japan in 1965, deeply controversial given the colonial history, but economically transformative. Japanese companies brought technology licenses, capital, and management expertise. Korean companies absorbed what they could, hired back Japanese engineers who would teach them, and then, over decades, developed their own capabilities. The student used the teacher's knowledge to eventually surpass the teacher. Chapter 4.
Samsung, Hyundai, and the Chaebol machine. The Chaebol are the most visible product of South Korea's development model and the most controversial. They are massive family-owned conglomerates that dominate every major sector of the Korean economy. Samsung alone accounts for roughly 20% of South Korean exports. Hyundai and Kia together are the world's third-largest automaker by volume. LG competes globally in electronics and display technology. SK is among the world's largest semiconductor manufacturers. The original Chaebol were not technology companies. Samsung started as a trading company selling dried fish and noodles. Hyundai started as a construction company. LG started as a chemical company. What transformed them was Park's system of directed credit and performance targets, combined with the willingness of Korean conglomerates to invest in manufacturing at a scale and speed that Western companies thought was reckless. When Hyundai decided to build cars in the 1970s, it had no automotive engineering experience. It licensed technology from Ford and Mitsubishi, hired engineers, built a factory, and within a decade was exporting cars to the United States. The conventional wisdom said this was impossible. The Chaebol ignored the conventional wisdom. By the 1990s, the Chaebol had moved into semiconductors, at the time the most technologically demanding manufacturing sector in the world. Samsung invested in DRAM memory chips at a moment when the global market was collapsing, and every Western analyst was calling it a terrible decision. Samsung's logic was that if you invest when everyone else is retreating, you capture market share at the bottom and own the market at the top. It was right. Samsung's semiconductor division eventually became the world's largest memory chip manufacturer, and the profits from chips funded every other part of Samsung's business. Today, Samsung and SK Hynix together produce approximately 65% of the world's DRAM memory chips. Chapter 5. The Bubble That Broke Japan. While South Korea was building its industrial base through the 1980s, Japan was experiencing something altogether different, the most extraordinary asset bubble in modern economic history. Between 1885 and 1989, Japanese land and stock prices tripled. At the peak, the land value of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index reached 38,915 on December 29, 1989. Japanese companies were buying American landmarks, Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course. Japanese banks were the world's largest. The mood was one of invincibility. Japan was not just catching America, it was going to surpass it. The bubble burst on January 1, 1990. The Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool the overheating economy. The stock market collapsed. The Nikkei fell 60% in less than 3 years. Land prices followed. Banks that had lent against soaring property values found their loan books destroyed. The Japanese financial system entered what economists call a balance sheet recession, a period in which companies and banks focus on paying down debt rather than investment, regardless of how low interest rates go. You can cut interest rates to zero, but if every company is focused on debt reduction rather than investment, monetary policy stops working. The lost decade, which became 3 lost decades, was not a simple recession. Japan's GDP in 2023 was barely larger than it was in 1995, measured in dollars. Japanese workers' real wages were essentially flat from 1990 to 2020, 30 years of no wage growth. The Nikkei index did not return to its 1989 peak until February 2024, 34 years after the crash. No developed country in the post-war period has experienced anything remotely comparable in duration or severity. The structural causes of Japan's stagnation are debated by economists to this day.
But the most important factors are the failure to restructure the banking system after the bubble burst, allowing zombie companies, companies that could not survive without government support, to persist and block the reallocation of capital to more productive uses. The demographic collapse. Japan's working-age population began shrinking in the 1990s and has been shrinking ever since. And the cultural resistance to the creative destruction that market economies require to reinvent themselves.
Chapter 6. The 1997 Crisis, South Korea's Near-Death Experience. South Korea's rise was not uninterrupted. In 1997, South Korea came within days of a complete economic collapse that would have wiped out everything Park had built over the previous 35 years. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 began in Thailand but spread rapidly to Korea. The mechanism was straightforward. Korean companies and banks had borrowed heavily in foreign currencies, primarily US dollars, to fund rapid industrial expansion. When the Thai baht collapsed and contagion spread, foreign lenders demanded repayment. Korea's foreign exchange reserves, the dollars it needed to repay those loans, ran out. By December 1997, Korea had less than a week's worth of foreign exchange reserves remaining. The IMF agreed a $58 billion bailout, at the time the largest in IMF history, on conditions so harsh that ordinary Koreans donated their gold jewelry to the National Reserve Fund. What Korea did next is the part of the story that explains everything about why South Korea eventually surpassed Japan. The crisis was not denied, delayed, or managed around. The government used it as the opportunity to do what it had been avoiding: restructure the Chaebol, force weak companies to close, reform the banking system, and open the economy to foreign investment. Daewoo, one of the 5 major Chaebol, was allowed to collapse. Workers were laid off. Companies that could not compete were not rescued. The pain was severe and concentrated in a very short period. By 2001, South Korea had repaid the IMF loan 3 years early. GDP was growing again at 8%. Japan, facing a structurally similar banking crisis in the 1990s, chose the opposite path. It did not force bank restructuring. It did not allow zombie companies to close. It managed the decline carefully and gradually, spreading the pain over decades rather than concentrating it in years. The result was that Japan avoided a Korean-style crisis in 1997 and spent the next 3 decades in slow stagnation instead. Chapter 7. The Overtaking: How the Student Beat the Teacher. The graphic on your screen captures the overtaking in every dimension, but 3 rows are worth dwelling on specifically. The first is wages. From 1990 to 2020, the average Japanese worker's real wages were essentially flat, 30 years of no pay increase. In the same period, the average South Korean worker's real wages doubled. Korean workers are now paid more in real terms than Japanese workers. This is perhaps the most striking single statistic in the comparison, that a country which was paying its workers subsistence wages in 1960 now pays them more than one of the world's most advanced economies. The second is R&D investment. South Korea spends approximately 5% of its GDP on research and development, among the highest in the world, and significantly higher than Japan's 3.3%. This investment has translated directly into technological leadership in specific sectors: Samsung and SK Hynix in memory chips, LG Energy Solution in battery technology, Hyundai in electric vehicles. South Korea is not simply catching up with the technology frontier. In several areas, it has moved past it. The third is productivity per hour worked. South Korea's productivity per hour of work has more than doubled since 2000. Japan's has grown slowly and has actually fallen relative to the United States. South Korea's workers now produce more value per hour than Japan's. The student has become more efficient than the teacher. Chapter 8.
where they are now, and the challenges both face. South Korea in 2026 is an economy at the top of the world and facing the same demographic trap that destroyed Japan's growth model. The birth rate in South Korea in 2023 was 0.72, the lowest of any country ever recorded. Not just the lowest in the world, the lowest in the history of demographic measurement. The average South Korean woman is having fewer than one child in her lifetime. At that rate, South Korea's population will halve within 2 generations. The working-age population is already shrinking. The dependency ratio, the number of retired people relative to working people, is on course to become the most extreme in the developed world by the 2040s. South Korea has watched Japan's demographic decline with the clarity of a country that knows exactly what is coming, because Japan got there first. The Korean government's attempt to reverse the birth rate have so far been unsuccessful. Since 2006, South Korea has spent an estimated $200 billion on pro-natality policies. The birth rate has continued falling. The structural causes, housing costs in Seoul that consume most of a young professional's income, a culture of extreme educational competition, and a labor market that still effectively penalizes women who take career breaks for children, have not been addressed by cash transfers alone. South Korea in 2026 is showing signs of a tentative recovery from its 3 lost decades. The Nikkei hit a new all-time high in 2024 for the first time in 34 years. Corporate governance reforms are forcing Japanese companies to return more capital to shareholders. Real wages are finally rising after 30 years. Tourism revenue, driven by a weak yen, is at record levels. The structural problems, demographic decline, debt at 260% of GDP, zombie companies, have not been solved, but after 3 decades of stagnation, Japan is at least moving. The deeper lesson of the Japan-South Korea comparison is not simply that the student beat the teacher. It is about what it takes to sustain economic success. Japan's mistake was not building its economic miracle, it was failing to adapt when the model that built the miracle stopped working. South Korea's success was not just in replicating the Japanese model, it was in being willing, after 1997, to destroy what was not working and build something more resilient. Both countries now face the same ultimate test. Can a society that grew rich on manufacturing and exports reinvent itself in a world where the competitive advantage lies in software, services, and innovation? South Korea is attempting this reinvention with the urgency of a country that remembers $79 per capita. Japan is attempting it with the caution of a country that remembers 1989. In 1960, South Korea's GDP per capita was $79. Japan's was $479. The teacher left the student with nothing. The student looked at everything the teacher did, learned from every mistake, and in 60 years closed a gap that by any conventional measure was unclosable. This is Macro Atlas. Thank you for watching.